I'm Tasneem Essop, and you're listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. In this sixth episode, we hear from Mahlatse Rampedi, whose work focuses on energy poverty, affordability, and community-level experiences of the transition. On paper, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy once led the just transition. But in reality, it is communities, activists, and researchers who have carried the work from below. Even as government stalls, people are experimenting with their own forms of transition. Grassroots cooperatives, women-led solar projects, trial-run clean energy appliances, and local NGOs reframing energy not as a commodity, but as a right. These are glimpses of what transformation could look like when justice becomes a lived process rather than a policy slogan. The argument's been made by a number of organizations that we can't think about the transition just as an energy transition. And I think this is where the question of justice and the just transition comes in. So, for example, Groundwork frames the just transition as systems change, not just climate change. Right? So pulling it away from just the argument around climate change to something that is broader than that. What do you think this means in practice for communities that are affected by this directly?
In practice, it means that the transition for the people is not just moving away from coal. It's not just about bringing in technologies, but it's a whole movement of the whole system itself. It's about creating new opportunities for work, for training, for education, something that will sort of like influence the development of like sustainable livelihoods, for example. Essentially, it's something that would include things like gender equality, local ownership, environmental health, prioritise within the situation. So it's about rethinking the entire system of governance and economics so that it works for the people, not just like the few interested parties. It should be a systemic change that improves the lives of people in a much deeper, more lasting way, not just changing the source of energy.
Sure. Tell us a bit about the grassroots environmental justice organizations and movements that you've done work with or that you've come across, and in that, how they are framing the just transition as something that's not just about technology, but is also about livelihoods, broadening democracy, equality, equity, and those sorts of things.
It's been quite interesting working in Mpumalanga. We've met a few NGOs and grassroots movements. We met some in Ochis, in Malahleni. We've met some all the way to where they're doing the next part of decommissioning the past in Hendrina. As far as Hendrina, they've been quite influential grassroots movements. They've been quite interesting in the sense that they have been at the forefront of, teaching people about what the transition is all about and how it's going to unfold. So I appreciate their sense of trying to educate communities. They provide that educational aspect of the transition. Secondly, they sort of like push for policies that go beyond, for example, installing new technologies. They push for policies that invest in job creation, for example, in training and local ownership of renewable projects. By advocating for those things, they've sort of like made sure or tried to push distributive justice, in a way that they can help everybody share in the gains, not just a few. And in their promotion of democracy, the way they try to hold the government and the state responsible, by pushing transparency and accountability from the government. And that has been quite interesting to watch. I can give you two examples. There was one interesting one in a place called, when was this place? It's in Emalahleni, Kwaguqa. There's interesting organization led by women is pushing for gender equality and transparency. Like in their attempt to sort of like educate people, it wasn't only just by holding meetings and talking and letting people question and answer some things that are quite concerning for them. They went and they got like a single solar light. They put it in the office that they work on. During that heavy cycle of load shedding, that was the only place that had lights, just so people can see that, and this transition is quite sustainable. It's something that will benefit the community, you know. And from there on, just by not saying anything, that light was a bit of a symbol of, that, the transition isn't like a big sort of like problem. It's something that is quite welcome and something that is going to improve the livelihoods of the communities. And I think they achieved a lot just by putting that symbol there and saying, you see what we can do if we move efficiently. But at the same time, they're pushing for the transition to be fair, to be transparent, and to have the benefits distributed to everybody. And I've also appreciated Groundwork's role in this. They have been sort of like trying to test, maybe through trial and error, some of the projects that are coming in from ESCOM, like trying to see how people perceive the transition itself and what works and what does not work. And people can literally bring in evidence to say, no, this particular kind of thing doesn't work. So an example was one of their drives to sort of like, moving away from using coal within houses, for example, and trying to install gas appliances. That was a trial run, which I think was quite successful because, they could show the benefits of that, and they would get people to engage in how these systems work, try to be the first beneficiaries of that installation of new appliances, for example. Another thing is that a lot of them are pushing the conversation around procedural justice, because this is something that a lot of people never really consider, particularly people from the communities, that there has to be a certain level of inclusion and, so to say, justice in how the weight of their voices within these discussions. And I think that this is quite amazing. And in these particular situations, they engage with local government, for example. They engage with ESCOM, they engage with the DMRE, they engage with the PCC, and that has sort of like brought the voices of the people closer to some of the most important discussions around the transition in the province and country.
Affordability, participation, and ownership are now the front lines of energy justice. The question is no longer whether the transition will happen, but who it will include. I think that's such an important story that you tell us about the women's organization and the solar light, because I think there is this perception that a lot of communities in coal-affected areas, mining-affected areas, are against the transition. But I think what I'm getting a lot from this conversation today is that there are a lot of positives that communities see for themselves and that organizations see for themselves. And I know you've also done, that's kind of linked to the conversation about electricity, and I know you've done a lot of work on power and electricity. And I just want to bring it back to the broader question about state reform, and how those questions of affordability, access to energy poverty, and of course you're giving us an example of load shedding, but energy poverty in general. How do those connect with the kind of debates around state reform and what's needed there?
For us, looking at energy poverty itself, affordability is the litmus test in all of this. The biggest question that people are asking is, can we afford this and can we afford, energy as the transition unfolds and when the transition is going into its complete phase? So that comes from that idea that, that the state has struggled a lot in providing electricity, for example. Electricity has been extremely, extremely expensive for most people, and livelihoods, of course, have been affected by this. It goes back to the whole idea in reforming, for example, tariff and municipal finance systems. Municipalities have relied on like electricity surpluses to sort of like, for other services, for example, and decarbonization is a huge sort of like dent in this thing. So they are going to struggle, in a lot of ways to keep the lights on for people. And the other thing around reforming is that, looking at, and this has been spoken a lot around PARI corridors, for example, like to reshape the affordability metrics. We've never really had, a minimum sort of like level or threshold or kilowatts per hour for people to say, you know what, this is the amount of money that people, particularly people in the indigent registered, could pay for electricity per month. And without that kind of reform, without rethinking how we think of affordable access, it will just reproduce energy poverty, continuously. And another thing, and then this comes a bit from the PCC as well, is that we need to include like participation as part of reform. We've been talking a lot about procedural justice, but that has not really translated completely in talks around the transition itself. So things like social ownership, that is, if you look at the PCC, for example, you can provide concrete models and alleviate a bit this trust or the lack of trust that people actually have in the transition itself. So, there has to be that alignment. The shift has to be much greater. Just looking at it alone, affordability and municipal tariffs, and looking at access, setting a benchmark for access, and incorporating participation as part of the shift itself. It becomes a great risk mitigation tool if it's structured, if it's concrete, if it's clear.
The just transition is not only about moving from coal to renewables. It is about transformation itself, about who owns, who benefits, and who decides. The DMRE may be gone, but its legacy remains inside its successors. For the Department of Electricity and Energy and the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, the challenge is now to rebuild trust, work across silos, and anchor the transition in South Africa's broader project of equality and justice. Only when decarbonization goes hand in hand with inclusion will we see a truly transformed energy future. I'm Tasneem Essop, and you've been listening to Just Access, The Real Transition, a podcast from PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute. To learn more about PARI and their research, visit pari.org.za. If you found this episode useful, please like, follow, or subscribe, and share it with others, and keep listening.